SACC peer review of the review of the 2024 draft risk evaluation for 1,1-dichloroethane and 2024 draft human health hazard assessment for 1,2-dichloroethane. And I would like to welcome everyone in today's preparatory virtual meeting. As the DFO for today's meeting, I serve as a liaison between the peer reviewers and the agency. In my role as a DFO, it's a critical responsibility, and I work with the appropriate agency officials to ensure that all appropriate ethics regulations are satisfied. In that capacity, peer reviewers are briefed on the provisions of the federal conflict of interest laws, and each peer reviewer has filed a governmental confidential financial disclosure report, which has been reviewed to ensure that all ethics requirements have been met. This is a preparatory meeting focused on the scope and clarity of the charge questions. The meeting is for peer reviewers and the public's benefit. We have public commenters who registered to make brief comments related to the clarity and scope of the charge questions. The agency appreciates peer reviewers' time and diligent work in preparing for this meeting and the public for attending and sending comments. The agenda and EPA presentation for this meeting is posted on the TSCA website at https://www.epa.gov/TSCA-peer-review-review. Actually, TSCA-peer-review. Sorry about that. Now, the meeting support documents, they're located on the docket at regulations.gov at docket number EPA-HQ-OPPT-2024-0114. Please be advised that agenda times are approximate, and when the discussion for one topic is completed, discussions for the next topic will begin. I also want to say thank you to my EPA colleagues for all of their efforts and all of their help in preparing for today's meeting. Joining me during this session are Steve Knott, and he is the Peer Review and Ethics Branch Chief at the Office Program Support, Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention in EPA. Tamu Gibson, who is the Executive Secretary and a designated federal official. Ala Kamal, who is a designated federal official and a chemist. Charlene Matten, who is a biologist, a designated federal official, and an assistant deputy ethics official. William Woogie, who is a designated federal official and an assistant deputy ethics official. Joyce Coates and Barbara Ewell, and also the EPA contractor Indina, who will provide administrative and technical support in today's meeting. Also with us today is the EPA Office of Pollution Prevention and Toxic Team for dichloroethanes. Today's preparatory virtual meeting is not a formal Federal Advisory Committee Act meeting, but is scheduled for you to discuss the charge and for the public to provide input on the charge questions. The public has been asked to provide questions on the charge only. You should listen to their input and feel free to ask them any questions to clarify their remarks. Again, the focus of this meeting is the scope and clarity of the charge. Likewise, there will be one EPA presentation, and you are invited to ask questions of the speaker to obtain any clarifications. Once the public has made their comments, I will lead through the charge questions and ask the committee for any or all comments or suggestions on each one of the charge questions. You should individually feel free to provide any feedback, including feedback that may incorporate suggestions from public commenters. This is the committee's opportunity to ensure that the charge you are given is clear, provides answerable questions, and will help inform EPA's future actions. And we here at the EPA, we welcome your suggestions. After today's meeting, EPA will collate all the comments, incorporate feedback as appropriate, and send a revised charge to the committee. If revised, the final charge will also be posted in the docket and on our webpage, which is the EPA TSCA SACC peer review webpage. Now, in regards to the meeting operations, we will ensure adequate time for agency presentations, public comments, and peer reviewers to discuss their questions with agency presenters and public commenters. This meeting is being webcast over the internet via YouTube and by teleconference for audio. Speakers are asked to state their names and affiliations, and this meeting is being recorded. There is a public docket for this meeting, and copies of all of the meeting materials and public comments will be available at regulations.gov under the docket number listed in the Federal Register notices and as stated earlier. We posted a draft agenda for the meeting and the EPA presentation at regulations.gov under the same docket number. In addition, links to the meeting information and supporting documents for this meeting are also available on the SACC website, again at www.epa.gov/TSCA-peer-review. And keep in mind, this meeting is only for points of clarification regarding the charge, not for review or public discussion of the technical information for responses to the charge questions. For members of the public who previously requested time to make a public comment, your remarks need to be limited to 5 minutes. And for those who are listening in, at the appropriate point noted on the agenda, I will call for public comments and our operator will open the phone line for the speakers. Again, I wish to thank the reviewers for your participation in today's meeting. I will now turn it over to our esteemed chair, Dr. George Cobb. He will lead us in a few minutes in introductions of the SACC members and the ad hoc peer reviewers.
Thank you, Allie, and thanks everyone for joining us today. I'd like to thank the EPA for pulling together the charge questions and the report that we're reviewing, and the public for joining us as well. We've got quite a bit to do this afternoon, so let's simply do some introductions. My name is George Cobb. I'm the chair of the Environmental Science Department at Baylor University, and I am an environmental analytical chemist by training, looking mostly at exposure and uptake of chemicals. And now moving into the rest of the committee to introduce themselves, Dr. Apte.
Hi, everybody. My name is Udayan Apte. I'm a professor at Department of Pharmacology, Toxicology, and Therapeutics at University of Kansas Medical Center. And my expertise is in liver disease, liver toxicology, and effect of environmental chemicals on the liver.
Thank you. Dr. Fong.
Hi, good afternoon. My name's Art Fong, and I am the technical leader for Smarter Chemistry at Apple. And my expertise is in green and sustainable chemistry and toxicology. Thank you.
Welcome. Dr. Fox.
Hello, Mary Fox. I'm an associate practice professor at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. I have expertise in epidemiology, chemical risk assessment, and cumulative risk assessment.
Thank you. Dr. Gentry.
Hello, I'm Robin Ann Gentry. I'm a board certified toxicologist and principal with Ramble Consulting. And I have over 35 years of experience in all the steps of human health risk assessment, both quantitative and qualitative.
Thank you. Dr. Graham.
Hello, I'm Cynthia Graham. I'm a toxicologist, and I'm an independent consultant, and my expertise is in respiratory and dermal sensitization.
Thank you. Ms. Jenkins.
Good afternoon. I'm Allison Jenkins. I'm a toxicologist, and Human Health Risk Assessor at the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality in Austin, Texas. Thank you.
Dr. Lee.
Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. So I'm Lee, Assistant Professor of Environmental Health at University of Nevada, Reno. I'm an environmental chemist and exposure scientist by training. I develop a computational model to simulate the chemical accumulation, transport, and transformation in the environment and in the human body. Thanks.
Thank you. Dr. Ottinger.
Hello, my name is Marianne Ottinger. I'm a professor emeritus and research professor at the University of Houston. My expertise is in endocrinology, ecotoxicology, and developmental and aging issues.
Thank you. Dr. Semmel.
Hello, I'm Jennifer Sommel, and I work at Insight Exposure and Risk Sciences, and my expertise is in exposure science and in human health risk assessment, with particular areas of expertise in dermal exposure assessment and dermal chemical uptake, as well as occupational and consumer exposures to chemicals. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Engel? It's not here. Dr. Hernandez.
No, I'm sorry.
Oh, there you are.
I was just slow getting things clicked off. Bernie Engel, Purdue University, Fate and Transport Modeling. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Dr. Hernandez.
Good afternoon, I'm Jose. I am working right now in the System Assessment Center at the Argonne National Lab. And my expertise is mathematical modeling, environmental modeling, and my main area is chemical engineering.
Thank you. Dr. Kaluzny.
Good afternoon. I'm Yulia Kaluzhny. My primary training in biochemistry and cell and molecular biology. Right now, as of last year, I am independent consultant. As of 20 years, previous 20 years, I have industrial experience in non-animal approaches in toxicity testing, hazard labeling, risk assessment, as well as investigation of toxicity mechanisms.
Thank you. Dr. Landis.
Hi, I'm Wayne Landis. I'm a research professor emeritus at Western Washington University. My expertise is in environmental toxicology risk assessment. I've worked on such things as lots of chemicals, synthetic biology, and now we're incorporating climate change.
Thank you. Ms. Lynch.
Hi, everyone. Oh, there goes my video. I'm Heather Lynch. I work for Integral Consulting, been an environmental consultant for 15 years. I'm a toxicologist and also have expertise in human health risk assessment, specifically occupational and consumer exposure. Thanks.
Thank you. Dr. Malberti.
Hello, I'm Silvia Maverti. I'm a senior exposure scientist with ExxonMobil Biomedical Sciences. I am a chemical engineer and industrial hygienist by training, and my expertise is in occupational exposure assessment for occupational and consumer exposure assessment, both qualitative and quantitatively, and I'm doing human health risk assessment. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Rose.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jane Rose. I am a toxicologist and risk assessor at Procter & Gamble. My expertise is in the areas of inhalation exposure and hazard, as well as structure activity relationship-based risk read across. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Stice.
Yes, Sabina Stice, senior toxicologist at the United States Food and Drug Administration. My expertise is read across, structure toxicity relationships, computational toxicology, and regulatory toxicology.
Thank you. Dr. Xu.
Hello, everyone. My name is Hao Zhu. I'm a professor of biomedical informatics and genomics at the Tulane University. One of my major research interests is to use computational modeling to develop predictive models for chemical risk assessment purpose. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any members of the committee or ad hoc members that I missed?
Yes,
Okay.
this is Jennifer Priscilla.
Oh, I'm sorry. You were not going to be at the last meeting. I apologize. Sorry very much.
That's okay. I'm Jennifer Priscilla, a lead environmental health scientist with the Agency for Toxic Substance and Disease Registry, and my expertise is in human health risk assessment and exposure assessment. Thank you.
Anyone else? So thanks, everyone. And I thought I was going to get through the roll call without errors, and I've still continue to make at least one every roll call. So I'll turn this back over to our DFO, Ali Munir.
Thank you, Dr. Cobb, and welcome to our committee to today's virtual prep meeting. At this time, I will now turn to our agency speaker, Janet Burris, who will give the overview of the technical presentation for OPPT.
Hello, everyone. My name is Janet Burris. I work for EPA, OPPT, in ECRAD, and I am the assessment lead for the 1,1-dichloroethane risk evaluation. And you will be hearing today about two documents that are under the charge. And one is the full draft of the 1,1-dichloroethane risk evaluation, as well as the 2024 draft human health hazard assessment for 1,2-dichloroethane. And I'll explain in a few moments why you are receiving this technical support document for review as part of the review of the 1,1-dichloroethane risk evaluation. So next slide, please. As a background, 1,1-dichloroethane is a colorless, oily liquid. It has a chloroform-like odor, and you can see its structure to the right, a simple structure. It's primarily used in organic chemical manufacturing. It's volatile, and it's also soluble in water. This chemical is not imported into the US. Total production volumes for between 2015 and 2020 are between 100 million and 100 billion pounds. A high percentage of 1,2-dichloroethane is used for processing as a reactive intermediate, and a smaller percentage is used for commercial use as a laboratory chemical. We did not identify any consumer uses of 1,1-dichloroethane. So in this risk evaluation, there is not a risk evaluation for consumer uses. Next slide, please. In this picture, this is a document map that shows the component of the 1,1-dichloroethane risk evaluation. This document is large. It is all in one piece, meaning it is about 900 pages long, including the sections that you see here, as well as appendices. There are additional supplemental files, 30 plus, that are available. And in addition to that, we have our 1,2-dichloroethane human health hazard technical support document. Now, the reason for this is that as part of, as you'll see in your charge, our data was limited for human health hazard for 1,1-dichloroethane, and the agency, ECRAD, chose to use a read-across approach from an selected analog, which was 1,2-dichloroethane, to fill data gaps for human health hazard for 1,1-dichloroethane. Analogs were also selected for environmental hazard, and so that's the reason why there are two documents that are part of the charge and part of your review. Next slide, please. This is a map of what will be the 1,2-dichloroethane risk evaluation, which is scheduled to be published by the end of this calendar year as a draft. And you can see where the human health hazard technical support document fits into this particular risk evaluation. So the two documents are interrelated in that they both share the same human health hazard information. Next slide, please. And so we will begin with, first, I will take a break here and ask if there are any, turn it back to Allie and see if there are any questions concerning the documents and the publications that have been made available to our panel review members, which we appreciate your attention and your time.
Thank you, Ms. Burris. So I guess to follow up on Ms. Burris's question, does anybody have any questions in regards to the accessibility of the documents or anything else to answer her question? Okay, I'm not seeing any hands raised or anything. So at this time, we are going to call on our oral public commenters to provide oral comment on the clarity and scope of the draft charge questions. You have up to 5 minutes to make your oral comment. There will be a timer posted on the screen for 5 minutes. Please turn on your video when making your oral comment. The first person to make an oral comment is Dr. Marissa L. Kreider from Stantec Services Consulting Incorporated.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. My name is Marissa Kreider, and I'm a board-certified toxicologist with the Health Sciences Group at Stantec. We are a consulting firm with expertise in human health risk assessment and have been supporting the Vinyl Institute on all manner of topics related to the ongoing risk evaluations of both 1,1-dichloroethane and 1,2-dichloroethane. My comments today have been prepared on behalf of the Vinyl Institute, their members, and affiliated consortia. Based on the charge questions issued to the SACC, it is clear that EPA has a solid understanding of the limitations associated with both the draft risk evaluation for 1,1-dichloroethane and the hazard assessment for 1,2-dichloroethane. The purpose of my comments today will be to highlight questions the VI would advocate for inclusion in the charge questions, as well as areas for consideration by the SACC related to such questions. The VI has submitted formal written comments with additional context to the docket, but at this time I seek to highlight the most important points of this assessment. First, we urge the EPA to expand their questions to include an assessment of the appropriateness of exclusion of several drinking water studies, most notably Munson et al. 1982, NTP 1991, and an extended one-generation reproductive toxicity study conducted at Will Research and submitted to the agency in 2015 in response to an EPA-issued enforceable consent agreement. These studies were deemed uninformative by the agency following their qualitative review on the basis that water consumption is reduced in animals with increasing concentrations of 1,2-dichloroethane in drinking water. However, such studies may provide important weight of evidence considerations regarding hazard potential for 1,2-dichloroethane, as well as important dose response information that could critically alter conclusions reached by the EPA in their hazard assessment for 1,2-dichloroethane. Notably, ATSDR relied on NTP's drinking water study for derivation of their intermediate minimum risk level. Furthermore, the findings of Munson et al. 1982 and the extended one-generation reproductive toxicity study call into question the hazards upon which the agency based points of departure for their subchronic and chronic toxicity benchmarks for oral and inhalation routes of exposure, respectively. Therefore, the agency's decision to exclude these studies may not be appropriate and/or justifiable. Secondly, we urge the EPA to expand the line of questioning to include an evaluation of the appropriateness of the occupational exposure limit derivation found in Appendix N of the 1,1-dichloroethane risk evaluation. This request includes the derivation of acute, intermediate, and chronic non-cancer values and the chronic cancer-based occupational exposure values. In addition to evaluating the appropriateness of the study used to identify the points of departure and/or any benchmark dose modeling used to establish the point of departure, as is already included in the charge questions, we ask that the SACC be instructed to comment on the appropriateness of the calculations and the selection of uncertainty factors used to dictate the desired margins of exposure, particularly with the working population in mind. Notably, as worker populations do not involve children or elderly, the variability in the population is often regarded as reduced compared to the general population, and thus default uncertainty factors for intra-species variability, such as those used by the agency in this case, are likely to be overly conservative. Lastly, with respect to the cancer-based occupational exposure value, we urge the agency to consider questions regarding the derivation of this value from Nagano et al. 2006. Specifically, we encourage questions regarding the appropriateness of the linear low-dose extrapolation methods as they are applied to 1,2-dichloroethane and further extrapolated to 1,1-dichloroethane. Evidence for in vivo mutagenicity and genotoxicity of 1,2-dichloroethane is equivocal at best, and a recent study focused on elucidating a mode of action for carcinogenicity of 1,2-dichloroethane concluded the mode of action is likely to be non-genotoxic. Therefore, a careful assessment of mode of action and its implications for the development of screening values is essential for the SACC review. With that, I thank the agency and the SACC for their time and commitment to a high-quality review of both the 1,1-dichloroethane risk evaluation and the 1,2-dichloroethane hazard assessment, and hope that these additional recommendations for the SACC's review will enhance the thoroughness and thoughtfulness of the review process. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Kreider. Does OPPT have any questions or comment to Dr. Kreider's oral comment as it relates to the clarification or scope of the draft charge questions? Please remember to turn on your video and state your name.
No, there's no follow-up. Thank you from EPA.
Thank you. Is there anyone from the committee that has any questions or comments to Dr. Kreider's oral comment? Please remember to turn on your video and state your name. Okay, I don't see any hands raised. So I will go ahead and now move on to the next oral commenter. The next person to make an oral comment is Dr. Jessica Ryman from the American Chemistry Council, or ACC. I will now turn it over to Dr. Ryman.
Okay, great. Thank you. You can hopefully hear me and also see me. So I do have my camera on. So good afternoon. My name is Dr. Jessica Ryman. I'm a toxicologist by training, and I'm also Senior Director of Chemical Management at the American Chemistry Council, ACC. ACC is a trade association whose members apply the science of chemistry to make innovative products, technologies, and services. ACC advocates for the use of the best available science in all regulatory actions, to include risk evaluation under TSCA. These oral comments introduce and summarize our written comments, which provide greater detail on each of our points. So we would like to begin by applauding EPA for changing course from a proposed letter peer review to the present peer review format. And we would also like to make another general comment regarding the distinction between differing scientific opinions, or DSOs, and EPA policy. And what we want to highlight more specifically, or most specifically, is science policy matters related to risk assessment practices in the use of EPA guidance documents. We think these are not DSOs or differing scientific opinions, and that these go beyond the scope of the SACC. And we have two reasons for this. First, these were not, to our knowledge, developed under the auspices of the TSCA. And then secondly, these could have implications or ramifications that extend beyond TSCA risk evaluations. So in addition to these two these two general comments, we do have some specific ones. First, the charge questions for read across for both ecotoxicity and mammalian toxicity should consider whether or not EPA has sufficiently considered the relative potencies of the dose response relationships for 1,1 DCA and 1,2 DCA. And related to this is a study EPA and the SACC should be aware of by Sharp and Carter, which was published in 1993. And this study indicates that dichloroacetaldehyde, which EPA identified as a minor metabolite of 1,1-DCA, is metabolized by rat aldehyde dehydrogenase to a much lower extent than monochloroacetaldehyde. And 2-chloroacetaldehyde is a metabolite of 1,2-DCA. So we think this has implications both for read across as well as for the identification of ALDH2 mutation as a PESS. And then finally, in light of the limitations of read across from 1,2-DCA and the database for 1,1-DCA, as well as the cancer classifications, 1,2-DCA has a likely cancer classification, whereas 1,1-DCA has a possibly cancer classification. We think the SACC should address if dose response analysis for 1,1-DCA should even be performed. And as I mentioned, our written comments, provide more detail on everything that I've just provided here. So, ACC appreciates the opportunity to comment.
Thank you, Dr. Ryman. Does OPPT have any questions or comment to Dr. Ryman's oral comment as it relates to the clarification or scope of the draft charge questions? Please remember to turn on your video and state your name.
This is Neria Rentis, exposure assessor with EPA, and no, we do not have any follow-up questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone from the committee that has any questions or comments to Dr. Ryman's oral comment? Please remember to turn on your video and state your name. Okay, I don't see any hands raised, so I guess there's no questions from the committee. Thank you very much, Dr. Ryman. We are now moving to the discussion and clarity of the draft charge questions portion of the agenda. So we're now going to put up the environmental exposure slide as charge question number 1 momentarily. All right, so we're starting with charge question number 1, where it discusses about environmental exposure. If you all can please take an opportunity to read this question to yourself, and read this question to yourself, and then before I go ahead and ask the committee if they have any questions. And next slide, because it continues on the next slide, the text. Neria Orentas from OPPT will now read the charge question 1A or 1.
Thank you, Ali. This is Neria Rentas. Exposure.
Back, please. This one, the bottom paragraph.
Yes,
thank you.
Thank you. Neria Rentas, Exposure Assessor, US EPA. Please comment on the use, representativeness, and relevancy of the 2016 annual release data for estimating environmental exposure in the draft risk evaluation via surface water for this facility over its operating days.
Thank you, Neria. Does anyone from the committee have any clarifying questions or any questions about the scope of this question? All right, I see George.
Yeah. Do I read this question that the charge question only relates to this specific facility in Louisiana and not other facilities across the country?
Correct. This particular facility is the only manufacturing condition of use facility, and it is the only one located in under this kind of location is important in the data, the release data that we considered.
Okay.
Are there any additional questions for Neria? All right, we'll go ahead and move on to the next charge question. This charge question goes over the read-across analysis for the environmental assessment. And please take a moment to read this charge question to yourself before I go ahead and ask the committee if they have any questions. And I'll turn it over to Janet Burris to please read 2A.
This is Janet Burris with EPA. Please comment, so part A, please comment on the strengths and uncertainties related to the read-across approaches used for the selection of the analogs for aquatic organisms and environmental assessment as outlined in Appendix J.1 of the draft risk evaluation. If appropriate, please provide additional methodologies that EPA could use to identify analogs for 1,1-dichloroethane for use in the ecological risk assessment. Next slide, please.
Well, before we go on to the next slide, I'd like to ask the committee if anyone from the committee has any clarifying questions or any questions about the scope of 2A.
So I do. This is Wayne.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, Janet. Good to see you again. How long do you want this to be? I say that just a little bit in jest. The read across looks, when I've read about it, looks very straightforward. I don't know, and it looks to be very qualitative. So I guess my question is, how actual quantitative is this risk assessment? What's your end game here? Because I'm used to usually very detailed risk assessments where we have some information, but we use QSARs and lots of other things other than a read across methodology. So when I read this, and I read the documents, I'm not quite sure how low the what the uncertainty parameter is to evaluate this risk assessment. Is it high uncertainty, moderate uncertainty? Is there any quantification to this that the read across could cover as opposed to using a more quantitative approach? I know it's a very detailed question, but you know me, I can't help it.
Hi, this is Karen Eisenreich at the EPA. I think, Dr. Landis, what is your question regarding the clarity of the charge? Because it sounds like you're going into more discussion of the environmental assessment itself as presented in the risk evaluation, which we would hold until the actual SACC.
So you're commenting on the strengths and uncertainties reading across the read across. That's always compared to something else. And when I look at methodologies, I'm trying to look at the end game, what your target actually is, and what kind of accuracy and precision that you're going to require in this analysis.
Right, the risk evaluation actually presents all the data that we have for 1,1-dichloroethane in the risk evaluation. And we used read across and the methodology to fill in the data gaps that we had, which is shown in the risk evaluation. So the methodology does provide comparisons of why the read across is appropriate and why we would rely on the read across numbers.
I think I understand your answer.
If it's not clear in the risk evaluation, please provide your comments.
I will absolutely do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Landis. Dr. Ottinger has a question.
I think this is another question for Dr. Eisenreich. Is the expectation that the response is going to be limited to aquatic organisms, or is it fair to include terrestrial organisms and those that are dependent on feeding on aquatic organisms and around marshy areas and other areas?
Hi, this is Karen Eisenreich, EPA. We are limiting our assessment to the aquatic system in the read across at this time.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, OPPT. Oh, yes, go ahead, Dr. Landis.
Wayne Landis. So that's an interesting definition. What the previous question, organisms that feed on aquatic organisms are considered part of that environment. That's, if you're an ecologist, that's how you would have to approach it. So it sounds like they've got to be wet or live mostly in a wet environment to be considered as part of this ecosystem. Is that correct? It's not in the case. I've done lots of work in Canada and so forth, and they really look at the food web for many reasons when they're doing similar evaluations. From the answer I just heard, those things that use aquatic organisms as part of the food chain would not be incorporated.
We considered this in the trophic transfer analysis, which is part of the risk evaluation. And so we did consider ingestion of aquatic organisms by terrestrial organisms. So that was considered. And then Jennifer Brennan, who did this work on this part of the risk evaluation. Go ahead and make your comment, Jen.
All right, thank you.
Hello, this is Jennifer Brennan, US EPA. So Dr. Landis, the read across is focused on where we do not have data on 1,1-dichloroethane. And so when you're referring to potentially semi-aquatic receptors, we utilized 1,1-dichloroethane for terrestrial mammalian data. So we did not need read across in that case.
Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Landis. Thank you, OPPT. Now we will move on to charge question 2B.
2B, please comment on the selection of 1,2-dichloropropane and 1,12-trichloroethane as the analogs to support the 1,1-dichloroethane aquatic hazard database. Please also comment on the steps in the analysis, robustness, transparency of assumptions, and uncertainties in the conclusions, as well as the overall clarity with which the results are communicated. Thank you.
Thank you, Janet. Does anyone from the committee have any clarifying questions or any questions about the scope of this question? Right, I don't see any hands raised. Okay, we can move on to charge question number 3. So just take a moment to go ahead and read this. Janet, you can feel free to read this out loud if you want to. It's a short intro.
This is charge question concerns charge questions 3A to C. Limited non-cancer empirical toxicity data are available for 1,1-dichloroethane for oral exposures, and ECRAD did not identify available data for dermal and inhalation exposures for 1,1-dichloroethane. The Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, ATSDR, completed a toxicological profile for 1,1-dichloroethane in August 2015. EPA identified 1,2-dichloroethane as an analog for reading across to 1,1-dichloroethane non-cancer human health using the methodology found in section 5.2.1.3 of the draft risk evaluation. Next slide. So part A of the charge is please comment on strengths and uncertainties related to the read across approach and methodologies that are outlined in Appendix J.2 used for structural similarities described in section 5.2.1.3.1, physical and chemical properties, section 5.2.1.3.2, metabolic similarities, section 5.2.1.3.3, and non-cancer toxicological similarities, sections 5.2.1.3.5 in the draft risk evaluation. If appropriate, please provide additional methodologies that EPA could use to identify analogs for 1,1-dichloroethane for use in the human health risk assessment. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Janet Burris. Does anyone from the committee have any clarifying questions or any questions about the scope of this question? All right, no hands raised. Oh, okay, no hands raised, so we'll go to the next charge question, 3B.
3B, please comment on the selection of 1,2-dichloroethane as the analog to support the 1,1-dichloroethane non-cancer hazard database. Please also comment on the steps in the analysis, robustness, transparency of assumptions, and uncertainties of the conclusions, as well as the overall clarity with which the results are communicated.
Does anyone from the committee have any clarifying questions or any questions about the scope of this question? All right, I don't see any hands raised, so we'll go on to the next charge question 3C.
3C, please include in your comments the extent to which The ATSDR 2015 toxicological profile for 1,1-dichloroethane provides information relevant to support the risk evaluation under TSCA.
Thank you, Janet. Does anybody from the committee have any clarifying questions or any questions about the scope of this question? Okay, we'll go ahead and move on to the next charge question. Here we have a charge question number 4 about the human health assessment via oral exposures, non-cancer, acute exposures. I will turn it over now to Ali Shoati to read this charge question, including the intro.
Thank you, Ali. This is Ali Shohati, EPA. I'll be reading through charge questions 4 through 7. So charge question 4, as described in section 5.2.3 and section 5.2.6 of the draft risk evaluation, ECRAD is proposing to rely on dose-related changes in kidney weights from Storr et al. 1984 for the acute oral point of departure, table 5-42. 4A, please comment on the study quality, study protocol, study conduct, and data interpretation of the Storr et al. 1984 for 1,2-dichloroethane. Please include in your comments information about the appropriateness of using the findings from Storr et al. 1984 for deriving an acute oral point of departure for extrapolating non-cancer risk to 1,1-dichloroethane and 1,2-dichloroethane.
Thank you, Ali Shoati. Does anyone from the committee have any clarifying questions or any questions about the scope of this question? All right, no hands raised. I'm not seeing anything, so we'll go on to the next charge question 4B.
Okay, charge question 4B. This is Ali Shohati, EPA. Please also include comments on the selection of the benchmark response, BMR, selected, benchmark dose analysis models used, and those selected. Please comment on the clarity and completeness of the description of the BMD analysis.
Does anyone from the committee have any clarifying questions or any questions about the scope of this question? All right, I'm not seeing any hands raised or anything, so we'll go on to the last part of this charge question 4C.
Okay, Ali Shohati, EPA. 4C. If appropriate, please suggest alternative study or studies for use in deriving an acute oral point of departure for 1,1-dichloroethane and 1,2-dichloroethane.
Thank you, Ali. Does anyone from the committee have any clarifying questions or any questions about the scope of this question? All right, I don't see any hands raised, so we'll move on to the next charge question. Charge question number 5. So if you guys could just take a moment to quickly read this intro language, and then I'll then ask the committee if they have any questions. So. All right, next slide. All right, next slide. All right, if OPPT, Ali Shoti, could please read 5A. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellie. This is Ali Shohati, EPA. Charge question 5A. Please comment on the study quality of drinking water in gavage experiments in the same study protocol and study conduct and data interpretation of the Munson et al. 1982 4,1,2-dichloroethane. Please include in your comments information about the appropriateness of using the findings from Munson et al. 1982 for deriving short-term and chronic PODs for extrapolating non-cancer risk to 1,1-dichloroethane and 1,2-dichloroethane.
Thank you. Does anyone from the committee have any clarifying questions or any questions about the scope of this question? Not seeing any hands raised. Okay, so we'll move on to the next charge question. 5B.
Okay. Ali Shohati, EPA. Charge question 5B. Please comment on the study quality, study protocol, and conduct and data interpretation of the drinking water study within NTP 1991. Please include in your comments information about the appropriateness of using the findings from the drinking water study within NTP 1991 for deriving short-term and chronic PODs or extrapolating non-cancer risks to 1,1-dichloroethane and 1,2-dichloroethane.
Does anyone from the committee have any clarifying questions or any questions about the scope of this question? Okay, we'll move on to the next charge question.
Ali Shohati, EPA. Charge question 5C. Pending your comments on 4.A and 4.B, and if appropriate, please suggest any alternative study or studies, example, a TSCA 2015 toxicological profile for 1,1-dichloroethane, for use in deriving oral short-term and chronic PODs for 1,1-dichloroethane and 1,2-dichloroethane.
Does anyone from the committee have any clarifying questions or any questions about the scope of this question? Okay, I'm not seeing any hands raised, so I will go ahead and go to the next charge question. I believe we're in charge question number 6 now. Oh, we got a part D. All right. 5D.
Ali Shohati, EPA. Charge question 5D. Please comment on the extent to which there is potential for uncertainty associated to using short-term and subchronic studies for assessing chronic long-term exposure to 1,1-dichloroethane.
Does anyone from the committee have any clarifying questions or any questions about the scope of this charge question? Okay, so we don't have anybody asking any questions, so we'll go on to number 6. I'd like to pause momentarily. There was a peer reviewer who had said that there's a fire drill in her building, and I believe she has to evacuate. Is there anyone, I guess any of my colleagues, what are their thoughts? Do we move forward, or do we pause before she gets back, or should we pause before she gets back, or move on? Let's see. Well, we can go ahead and, okay, I see. Well, what we can do is we can take her questions when she comes back from the fire drill, and we'll continue to move on with this presentation. So moving on with charge question number 6. Charge question number 6 goes over the human health assessment via inhalation exposures, non-cancer acute. Please take a moment to quickly read the intro language on charge question number 6 before I open up before I ask the committee if they have any questions. Next slide. All right, OPPT, if you could please read out 6A.
Thank you. This is Ali Shawati, EPA. Regarding charge question 6A, please comment on the study quality, study protocol, study conduct, and data interpretation of the Dow Chemical 2006 for 1,2-dichloroethane. Please include in your comments information about the appropriateness of using the findings from Dow Chemical 2006 for deriving an acute inhalation point of departure for extrapolating non-cancer risks to 1,1-dichloroethane and 1,2-dichloroethane.
Thank you. Does anyone from the committee have any clarifying questions or any questions about the scope of this question? Okay, I don't see any hands raised, so we'll move on to the next question, 6B.
Thank you. Ali Shawati, EPA, regarding charge question 6B. Please also include comments on the selection of the BMR selected, BMC analysis used, and the clarity and completeness of the description of the BMC analysis.
Thank you, Ali Shawati. Does anyone from the committee have any clarifying questions or any questions about the scope of this question? Okay, I don't see any hands raised, so we'll move on to the next charge question. Charge question 6C.
Thank you. Ali Shawati, EPA, regarding charge question 6C. If appropriate, please suggest alternative study or studies for use in deriving an acute inhalation POD for 1,1-dichloroethane and 1,2-dichloroethane.
Does anyone from the committee have any clarifying questions or any questions about the scope of this question? Okay, we'll go ahead and move on to charge question number 7. And I do, in regards to the fire drill by the peer reviewer, it seemed like she didn't have to evacuate the building. It was just a test of the fire drill system. So she didn't have to leave the building, so which was good. Okay, just wanted to update people on that. All right, so we are now moving on to charge question number 7. Next slide, please. And if OPPT could please read the intro with number 7A, please.
Sure. Ali Shawati, EPA, regarding charge question 7. So, as described in section 5.2.6 of the draft risk evaluation, appendix F in the draft human health hazard technical support document for 1,2-dichloroethane, and in draft risk evaluation for 1,1-dichloroethane supplemental information file, benchmark dose modeling, BMD modeling was completed and used for short-term and chronic inhalation. Zhang, based on Zhang et al. 2017 exposure durations. See table 5-45, as well as appendix F for the draft technical support document. Please comment, so for charge, and that's the introduction. Charge question 7A. Please comment on the study quality, study protocol, study conduct, and data interpretation of the Zhang et al. 2017 4,1,2-dichloroethane. Please include in your comments information about the appropriateness of using the findings from Zhang et al. 2017 for deriving short-term and chronic inhalation PODs for extrapolating non-cancer risks for 1,1-dichloroethane and 1,2-dichloroethane.
Thank you. Does anyone from the committee have any clarifying questions or any questions about the scope of this question? All right, we'll move on to charge question 7B.
EPA. Regarding charge, this is Ali Shawati, EPA. Regarding charge question 7B, please also include comments on the selection of the BMR selected, BMC analyses used, and the clarity and completeness of the description of the BMC analysis.
Does anyone from the committee have any clarifying questions or any questions about the scope of this question? All right, we'll move on to the next charge question.
Thank you. Ali Shawati, EPA, charge question 7C. If appropriate, please suggest alternative study or studies, example, ATSDR 2015, ATSDR toxicology profile for 1,1-dichloroethane for use in deriving short-term and chronic inhalation points of departure for 1,1-dichloroethane and 1,2-dichloroethane.
Thank you. Does anyone from the committee have any clarifying questions or any questions about the scope of this question? All right, we'll move on to the next charge question. We are now at charge question 8, and it's about dermal absorption, their interpretation and use of the new in vitro study. Please take a moment to read what's on this slide and the next couple of slides. So before I ask the committee if they have any questions. So please take a moment. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And I will now turn it over to William Irwin to read charge question 8A.
Thank you, William Irwin, toxicologist, EPA. With regard to the overall recovery, EFSA 2017, page 13, stated that if no clear conclusion can be drawn, only values from high recovery samples should be used to derive the absorption, and replicates with low recovery should be excluded entirely. OECD 2022, page 39, provided similar guidance. In the case of the 1,1-dichloroethane study, where the recovery was greater than 80%, the non-COU dermal absorption ranged from less than 0.01 to 0.06%. So question 8A, please comment on the selection and derivation of EC-RAD's 0.3% dermal absorption factor and its appropriateness for developing the dermal exposure and risk assessments for 1,1-dichloroethane, considering the range of replicate values for conditions of use testing, percent mass recovery, and data variability. If appropriate, please provide comments on an alternate dermal absorption factor.
Does anyone from the committee have any clarifying questions or any questions about the scope of this question?
I do, Allie. This is Heather Lynch from Integral. Quick question on what do they mean by, or what does EPA mean by the neat COU exposure portion? I'm just wondering how they're defining COU in the context of this study.
So this is William Irwin, EPA. So COU means condition of use. The primary condition of use from our engineering analysis is the neat chemical, which is the 100% concentration.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lynch. Are there any other additional clarifying questions or questions about the scope of this question? If not, let's move on to the next charge question, 8B. Oh, okay, we're on number 9. Okay, then we only had one. All right, so please take a moment to read the entire intro, and before I go ahead and ask the committee if they have any questions. All right, next slide, please. All right, I will turn it over to William Irwin to read all of the charge questions associated with number 9, 9A.
9A, please comment on the strengths and uncertainties related to the read-across methodology used for selection of the analog for the cancer assessment as outlined in section 5.2.1.3 and appendix J2 of the draft risk evaluation. If appropriate, please provide additional methodologies which EPA could use to identify analogs for 1,1-dichloroethane.
Does anyone from the committee have any clarifying questions or any questions about the scope of this question? All right, Dr. Rose.
Thank you. Dr. Rose from the SACC. So I guess my main question relates back also to the question, charge question 3A. So I guess I'm trying to understand if both of these questions are referring to the same method, read across and analog identification methodology in section, in appendix J2, as well as in section 5.2.1.3. And so does this imply that the same read across approaches were used for both cancer and non-cancer assessments? And should we comment then, similarly for both of these questions and only diverge as we are evaluating the toxicological evidence to support either non-cancer or cancer endpoint? Hopefully that makes sense.
And in the meantime, Dr. Rose, I don't know if you were able to turn on your video or if you have
No.
it on.
Yeah, I did.
It's a black screen. Okay, it's a black screen. Okay, all right, no problem.
I'm
Thank
not
you.
sure what happened. Sorry.
That's okay. At least we can hear you.
Yeah.
So OPPT, do you have a response to Dr. Rose's questions?
Yes, this is Janet Burris from EPA. In answer to your questions, the same methodologies were used. So part 9A and 3A are related. The same steps were used to identify the analog, which was 1,2-dichloroethane for 1,1-dichloroethane.
Mm-hmm.
We did have separate analyses that compared non-cancer toxicological responses as well as cancer responses, as well as used a predictive methodology for cancer response. So the same methodology was used in terms of the steps. A few differences when it came to comparing toxicity in cancer, for non-cancer and cancer. So
Okay.
they're same section, same, so and stepwise the same. analysis. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. And so I guess maybe would it be helpful then to take, for completeness, to take the text that's in 3A that talks about similar methods used for structural similarity, phys-chem property similarity, metabolic similarity, and add that to the 9A text, just so that we're commenting on the similar kinds of features of that read across or analog selection process.
Does the program? Yeah. Does the program office have an answer to Dr. Rose's questions and comments?
We will take that into consideration.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. And Dr. Apti has a question.
So hi, I'm leading question 9, ABs, and so if what we just discussed is going to be the case, the way we're going to handle this, when we are looking at 9, I'm assuming we are still restricting ourselves to the the question as it is framed in terms of cancer assessment, and we're not commenting on other parts of the assessment, right? So people who are assigned to 9A and B, we are still going to focus our attention to cancer assessment. Is that right? Or do you want us to kind of go beyond that and collab? I mean, we'll collaborate with the other groups, of course, because it makes sense, but still, our charge is still going to be remaining on cancer assessment, right?
Not green. There you go.
Hi, I'm Anna Lowe, Science Advisor, OPPT. So Dr. Apti, that's a important question, so thank you for that. To the extent to which the panel may recommend harmonizing across cancer and non-cancer, we would certainly be open to those comments. So, as you suggested, that the two groups coordinate. But we recognize that the NAS has recommended a better harmonization across those endpoints. So if the panel has a reason to do that, we would certainly accept those comments. But I don't think it would result in a change to our charge question.
Sounds good.
Thank you, Dr. Apti. Did you have any more questions before I move on to Dr. Cobb? Okay, thank you, Dr. Apti. And Dr. Cobb, I see that you have your hand raised.
Yeah, just George Cobb, really quick. And I do think that charge questions 3 and 9 are different because one is non-cancer and one is cancer. Where they're situated spatially in the charge questions could be considered, but I think they probably are standalones at this point. But there is often crosstalk between those two questions. So the leads on question 3 and question 9 should be aware that there's often crosstalk between those two charge questions, those two types of charge questions. That's all.
All right, thank you, Dr. Cobb. And if you're not speaking, please turn your video off. All right, we will now move on to charge question 9B. I will turn it over to William Irwin to read it. Next slide, please. Yeah, here we go, 9B.
Thank you. 9B, please comment on the selection of 1,2-dichloroethane as the analog to support the 1,1-dichloroethane cancer hazard database. Please also comment on the steps in the analysis, robustness, and uncertainties of the conclusions and the clarity with which they are communicated.
Thank you, William. Does anyone from the committee have any clarifying questions or any questions about the scope of this question? All right, we'll move on to the next question, 9C.
9C, please comment on EPA's preliminary conclusion that the NTP 1978 mouse and rat cancer studies for 1,1-dichloroethane are not appropriate for use to quantitative risk assessment. Please also comment on the extent to which the 1,1-dichloroethane rat and mouse studies are or are not useful qualitatively in hazard identification and characterization.
Does anyone from the committee have any clarifying questions or any questions about the scope of this question? I don't see any hands raised, so we'll move on to 9D.
9D, please comment on the strengths and uncertainties and use of the Nagano et al. 2006 study with 1,2-dichloroethane to develop an inhalation unit risk for inhalation cancer assessment of 1,1-dichloroethane and 1,2-dichloroethane.
Does anyone from the committee have any clarifying questions or any questions about the scope of this question? All right, moving on to 9E.
9E, please comment on EPA's preliminary conclusion that the NTP rat cancer study for 1,2-dichloroethane is not appropriate for use to quantitative risk assessment. Please also comment on the extent to which the 1,2-dichloroethane rat study is or is not useful qualitatively in hazard identification and characterization.
Thank you. Does anyone from the committee have any clarifying questions or any questions about the scope of this question? All right, we'll move on to 9F.
9F, although internal peer reviewers recommended against using the NTP 1978 mouse cancer study to develop quantitative risk estimates, ECRAD has proposed to use it in the draft risk evaluation. Please comment on the quality, study protocol, study conduct, and data interpretation of the NTP 1978 mouse cancer study for 1,2-dichloroethane. Please include in your comments on the extent to which the 1,2-dichloroethane NTP 1978 mouse study is or is not useful qualitatively and or quantitatively in hazard identification, dose response, and characterization.
Thank you, William. Does anyone from the committee have any clarifying questions or any questions about the scope of this question? All right, we'll move on to 9G.
9G. Pending your comments on 9C, 9E, and 9F, and if the panel determines that NTP 1978 rat and mouse cancer studies are not appropriate for use in human health risk assessment, please provide initial comment on the extent to which the oral cancer risk can be and or needs to be assessed for in the risk evaluations for 1,1-dichloroethane and 1,2-dichloroethane.
Thank you. Does anyone from the committee have any clarifying questions or any questions about the scope of this question? All right, so thank you very much, William Irwin, for going over charge question number 9, A through G. We are now moving on to charge question number 10. And charge question number 10 discusses occupational exposure. I will now turn it over to Greg Masick to read charge question 10A.
Hi, this is Greg Masick, and I am a chemical engineer assessor in Office of Pollution Prevention and Toxics, Existing Chemicals. And I will be reading the charge questions that pertain to the occupational exposure assessment for 1,1-dichloroethane. So charge question 10A. As described in section 5.1.2 of the draft risk evaluation and in the draft risk evaluation for 1,1-dichloroethane supplemental information file, environmental releases and occupational exposure assessment, US EPA 2002-24D, EPA obtained primary inhalation exposure monitoring data for 1,1-dichloroethane for the occupational exposure scenario, OES, of manufacture through a test order. EPA prioritized the use of these occupational inhalation monitoring data for the intended condition of use and other appropriate exposure scenarios. For example, processing as a reactant and laboratory use OESs. Please comment on the study protocol and conduct of the study. Please also comment on ECRAD's interpretation, use, and representativeness of the manufacturing inhalation exposure monitoring data received through the test order as applied to other exposure scenarios.
Thank you, Greg. Does anyone from the committee have any clarifying questions or any questions about the scope of this question? All right, there aren't any hands being raised, so we'll go on to the next charge question, 10B.
Greg Masick, EPA. As described in section 5.1.1.1.3 of the draft risk evaluation and in the draft risk evaluation for 1,1-dichloroethane supplemental information file, environmental releases and occupational exposure assessment, US EPA 2024D, EPA used surrogate chlorinated solvent inhalation monitoring data to estimate occupational exposures for the general waste handling, treatment, and disposal OES, where there were a lack of inhalation monitoring data. EPA also applied a vapor pressure correction factor to account for vapor pressure differences between 1,1-dichloroethane and the surrogate chemicals, methylene chloride and 1,2-dichloroethane. Please comment on the appropriateness and representativeness of the surrogate data to estimate occupational exposures.
Does anyone from the committee have any clarifying questions or any questions about the scope of this question? All right, we will be moving on to 10C.
Greg Masick, EPA. As described in section 5.1.1.1.5 of the draft risk evaluation and in the draft risk evaluation for 1,1-dichloroethane supplemental information file, environmental releases and occupational exposure assessment, US EPA 2024D, EPA used the dermal exposure to volatile liquids model, DEVL, and applied the model to all OESs. However, values for fraction absorbed and weight fraction of the chemical can differ among OESs. In particular, a key parameter in the model is the dermal loading on the skin per exposure event. The values that EPA currently uses are based on experimental studies done with oils of different viscosities, US EPA 1992. Next page. Next page.
Does the committee have any clarifying questions or questions about the scope of this question, 10C? Okay, I guess I don't see any hands raised, so I believe we've now come to the end of the presentation, correct? Or was there another question, Janet? Okay, there wasn't. So
what else do we have?
All right, so there I don't see
I
any.
think there's a couple more slides, Allie, for
Okay.
the dermal.
Oh, okay, all right. So we'll go on to the next slide. The next sub question. Oh, CI. Okay, I'm sorry. Yes, 10 CI. Go ahead, Greg Masick.
Okay. Greg Masick, EPA. Please comment on the appropriateness of using a dermal loading value based on generic scenario of oils for risk assessment of 1,1-dichloroethane. If appropriate, please provide any information on dermal loading values that may be more applicable for 1,1-dichloroethane in the conditions of use assessed in this draft risk evaluation.
Thank you. For the committee, does the committee have any questions about clarification or scope of this question? All right, next slide, please.
Greg Masick, EPA. Please also provide comment on additional available data, models, and/or references on dermal exposure assessment, dermal loading, and/or dermal fraction absorbed, which could be used in the future to improve and refine the dermal exposure potential and risk evaluation of other chemicals and across various conditions of use.
Does anyone from the committee have any clarifying questions or any questions about the scope of this question? All right, and are there any more, or is this now the end? I believe this is now the end, right?
Yes, Sally, this concludes the slides.
All right, thank you, Greg. So we've gone through all the charge questions and given the committee the opportunity to ask any clarifying questions or any questions about the scope of the questions. I'd like to thank everybody today for their participation in the meeting, to the commenters, peer reviewers, and everyone listening in today. Are there any questions or comments? Are there any questions or comments before we adjourn today's meeting? Oh. Dr. Cobb?
Oh, no, I just wasn't.
Oh, okay.
Well, I just was not going to be absent while we closed off. But thank you everyone for attending, and I'm looking forward to a good meeting in a month or so.
Okay, and one final thing. I'm wondering if there is going to be if there's going to be any changes to the charge questions, and if so, when are the charge questions going to be revised by the program office? And when is the program office going to make it available for the committee?
Okay, we will let you know tomorrow.
If there's any changes to the charge questions.
Correct.
Okay. All right. And to the committee, I will be in touch with you to let you know if there's going to be a revised charge tomorrow. So are there any remaining questions or comments before we adjourn today? And I thought I saw Dr. Apti had his video on, and I don't know if he was getting ready to ask a question.
No, I'm just going to say bye.
Okay. All right. Well, if there's nothing else, again, thank you again, everybody. And I wish everybody a good rest of the afternoon. Goodbye.
The stream has ended.